Out of the car. Now. The old man didn't move. The younger officer stepped forward, hand on his holster. The old pickup creaked as the man opened the door, slowly without fear. Then just as the officer reached for his arm, the old man spoke. One word. One that made the officer freeze mid-motion. Because the name wasn't his own, it was the officer's father's. And he said it with full rank. Comment, honor never dies, if this gave you chills. Sunset painted the country road in amber and gold. A faded 1971 Chevy pickup rumbled along the cracked asphalt engine, humming with the particular cadence of machinery that's outlived its warranty by decades. Behind the wheel, James Jim Mallory checked his rearview mirror with the habitual vigilance of a man who'd learned the hard way that what follows behind matters. At 77, Jim's face carried the topography of a difficult life. Deep lines around his eyes from squinting into desert sun's creases, at the corners of his mouth from tight-lipped determination. His hands, spotted with age but still steady, gripped the steering wheel with quiet authority. Every Thursday, same route, same destination. The small cemetery outside town where marble headstones stood in perfect formation, much like the men they memorialized once had. Jim's truck slowed as he approached the cemetery gates. His side mirror, cracked and held together with duct tape, reflected the flash of headlights behind him. A police cruiser engine purring with the efficiency Jim's old Chevy had long since surrendered. Inside the cruiser, two officers watched as Jim's truck crawled to a near stop. "Looks suspicious," Officer Keller remarked, nodding toward the pickup. "Driving awfully slow, might be drunk or lost." Officer Mark Stafford, younger and newer to the force, nodded in agreement. "Let's run it." The cruiser's lights flashed blue and red against the darkening sky. Jim pulled to the shoulder, his expression unchanging as he watched the officers approach in his mirrors. "Sir, please step out of the vehicle," Keller called, one hand resting casually on his belt. Jim turned his head slightly. "Is there a reason you were driving erratically?" The officer responded, voice sharper. "Step out of the vehicle." Jim sighed and reached beside his seat, a deliberate movement toward the cane he needed to stand. "Keep your hands where we can see them," Stafford shouted, his posture suddenly tense. Jim's weathered face registered mild surprise, perhaps disappointment. "Son, he said, voice steady, "I'm 77 and holding a cane." "I said, step out now." Stafford's hand moved to his holster, a reflexive action born of academy training rather than necessity. The truck's door creaked in protest as Jim pushed it open. He moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had endured too much to risk sudden movements. His canvas jacket, faded and army green, hung loose on his frame. The veteran's cap he wore told a story the officers didn't bother to read. As Jim's boots touched the ground, Officer Stafford moved in quickly, hand rising to take control of the situation. But then, with calm certainty that stopped the moment the old man spoke a single word: "Stafford." The young officer froze, hands suspended in mid-reach. "What?" Jim looked him directly in the eye, his gaze level and unflinching. "Your father, 2nd Battalion, 2003, Mosul. I carried him out." The silence that followed seemed to stretch across years, across oceans, across battlefields. Officer Stafford stood immobile, his outstretched hand now frozen in a different context, no longer a gesture of authority, but a moment suspended between past and present. "You knew my dad." His voice had lost its edge, replaced by something almost childlike in its uncertainty. "More than that," Jim replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than boastful. "He nearly bled out in my arms. I didn't let him." Officer Keller stepped forward, confusion evident in his furrowed brow. Protocol reasserted itself in his stance and his voice. "Sir, we need to confirm your identity before proceeding." "Do you, Jim said, a hint of weariness in the question. With measured movements, he reached into his back pocket and retrieved a worn leather wallet. From inside, he withdrew not just his driver's license, but an old Department of Defense field badge, edges frayed, lamination yellowed with age, but the seal and credentials unmistakable. "That's real," Keller muttered, stepping back slightly. Meanwhile, Stafford hadn't moved. His face had drained of color, the authoritative demeanor of moments before completely vanished. "My dad told me about someone who saved him," he said quietly. "A sergeant who carried him through active fire after the convoy hit an IED. But I never had a name. He just called you Old Ghost." Jim finished for him, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Because I never left anyone behind. Not even when command ordered retreat." Why didn't you say anything earlier when we pulled you over? Jim's gaze hardened slightly. Because I wasn't the one acting like I was in charge of something I didn't understand. The rebuke, gentle as it was, landed with precision. Stafford looked away first. The radio on Keller's shoulder crackled to life. Another unit requesting a status report. Just a misunderstanding, Stafford responded, his voice unsteady. All clear. Jim nodded once, then turned back toward his truck. Don't be too quick to pull rank, boys, he said, settling back behind the wheel. Some of us earned it without ever needing a badge. As the officers returned to their cruiser, a third vehicle pulled up alongside an unmarked sedan with a single occupant. The window rolled down to reveal an older man with silver hair and the unmistakable bearing of command. Problem here, he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. No, sir, Keller replied. Just a routine stop. The man, Chief Dawson, retired sheriff, but still respected enough to command attention, looked past them to the old pickup now pulling away. Was that Jim Mallory? Stafford nodded slowly. Sir, I think I owe him more than I knew. Yeah, the former sheriff replied, watching the taillights recede into the gathering darkness. We all do. That man pulled half a platoon out of hellfire before most of you were born. Never got the medals he deserved because the mission was classified. He looked pointedly at the younger officers. Maybe remember that next time before you draw on a man for reaching for his cane. 2 days later, a brown envelope appeared at the precinct's front desk. No return address, no postmark, simply hand-delivered and left with the receptionist. Inside, a black and white photograph, grainy, taken in haste amid chaos. It showed a younger Jim Mallory face streaked with blood and dirt, carrying a wounded soldier through a haze of smoke and debris. The soldier's features were barely visible, but the name tape on his uniform read clearly, Stafford. Attached to the back with yellowing tape, a handwritten note. Tell your officers sometimes the man they stop is the reason they're still free to patrol. Officer Mark Stafford stared at the photograph for a long time, the busy precinct fading to background noise around him. That evening, he took it with him to his father's house on the outskirts of town. Michael Stafford Sr. lived alone now, his mobility limited by the injuries he'd sustained overseas. When his son laid the photograph on the kitchen table, the older Stafford's hands trembled as he reached for it. It's him, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Where did you find this? He found me, Mark admitted. Or rather, I pulled him over 2 days ago, near the Veterans Cemetery. His father looked up sharply. You pulled over Jim Mallory. What were you thinking? I didn't know who he was. Dad, you never told me the name of the man who saved you. The elder Stafford traced the outline of the figure in the photograph with his fingertip touch, reverent. I never knew his full name myself. We called him Old Ghost, because he appeared when hope was lost and disappeared before the brass arrived. He looked at his son's eyes, suddenly fierce. That man carried me 3 miles with a bullet in his own leg. When the medevac couldn't land, he found another way. When command said to leave the wounded, he refused. Blame. Mark sat heavily in the chair across from his father. I almost drew on him, Dad, because he reached for his cane. The silence that followed carried the weight of what might have been a tragic error, born of ignorance, averted by a single word. That Saturday, Mark drove to the cemetery and waited. When the familiar pickup truck arrived, he stood beside it, 2 cups of coffee in hand. Sir, he said as Jim approached, I owe you an apology, and my father owes you his life. Jim accepted the offered coffee with a nod, his weathered face revealing nothing. Then live like it's worth something, he said after a moment. That's all any of us can do. The following Monday, Chief Dawson called an unscheduled meeting at the precinct. No press was invited, no public announcement made. But when Jim Mallory walked through the door, his steps still measured his back, still straight, despite the cane every officer in the room stood. Not by command, by instinct. The chief unveiled a simple plaque to be hung in the hallway. Some heroes wear boots long after the war is over. Jim said little during the brief ceremony, but as he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway, looking back at the assembled officers. You don't need a siren to command respect, he said quietly. Just memory. In that moment, not one person in uniform doubted him. Life resumed its rhythm. Jim continued his Thursday visits to the cemetery where friends long departed kept their silent formation beneath marble and grass. But things had changed in subtle ways. When patrol cars passed his old pickup on the highway, they no longer ran his plates. Instead, officers would offer a small nod or occasionally a salute. At the local diner where Jim sometimes stopped for lunch, his coffee became mysteriously free, courtesy of officers who would leave before he could thank them. During a training session for new recruits, a young officer raised his hand. "Why do we stand when Mr. Mallory comes in?" What rank was he? The sergeant considered the question carefully before answering. Because he stood when no one else could, and his rank isn't what matters, it's what he did with it. A new item appeared in the precinct handbook, quietly added by Chief Dawson. Never assume, always ask. Some names carry weight beyond ranks. Jim never saw himself as anything special. Never asked for the recognition that now followed him through town like a respectful shadow. He was just a man who remembered what duty cost. Who gave the rest of his life reminding others silently by example that authority is earned in moments when no one is watching, and honor doesn't require an audience to matter. One day they will add his name to those he visited each Thursday. When they do, the entire department will stand. Not because they have to, because they remember. Subscribe to Wounds in Honor if you believe real authority doesn't need to raise its voice.